Scotland, 1891. The sea looked angry long before Annabel Whitmore ever saw Blackthorn Manor. The carriage wheels struggled against the muddy coastal road while cold rain struck the windows in uneven bursts. Beyond the cliffs, the North Sea crashed violently against dark rocks below, endless and merciless beneath a sky the color of old iron. Annabel pulled her coat tighter around herself and stared through the fog. Nothing about this place looked welcoming. The driver crossed himself quietly. "Storm's coming again," he muttered. "Sea's restless tonight." Annabel said nothing. The manor finally emerged through the mist like something carved from the cliff itself. Tall black stone walls. Narrow windows glowing faintly against the darkness. And above everything, standing farther along the coastline, was the old lighthouse. Its lantern still burned despite the wind. Blackthorn Manor looked less like a home and more like a place trying very hard to survive. The carriage stopped. Before the driver could help her down, the enormous front doors opened. Henry Ashcombe stood waiting. Even at 65, the Duke carried the kind of presence that made rooms quieter simply by entering them. Tall, broad shoulders. Silver hair swept neatly back. His expression severe enough to freeze conversation. But Annabel noticed something immediately. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. The deeper kind. The kind carried by people who had spent too long being afraid for someone they loved. "Miss Whitmore," Henry said. "Your Grace." His eyes moved over her carefully, measuring. Not cruelly, cautiously. As though 32 women before her had already disappointed him. "You came a long way." "Yes. You may still leave." Annabel looked past him toward the distant lighthouse. "I didn't come all this way to leave before I've even begun." Something unreadable crossed Henry's face. Then he stepped aside. "Come inside." The manor was colder than she expected. Not temperature. Atmosphere. The servants moved quietly, avoiding unnecessary noise. The hallways felt too large. Too silent. Like grief had lived there so long it had become part of the architecture. Henry led her into a dark study overlooking the sea. A fire burned low in the hearth. "You understand the arrangement?" he asked. "Yes. My son agreed only because I insisted." Annabel folded her hands calmly in her lap. "And does he hate you for it?" Henry gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Frequently." That almost made her smile too. Almost. Henry walked toward the window. 3 years ago my son survived a shipwreck during a winter crossing near these cliffs." His voice remained steady. Too steady. 21 men drowned. Annabel stayed silent. "He was found half-conscious on the shore 2 days later." Henry stared out at the violent sea below. "He has never forgiven himself for surviving." The room grew quieter. "The doctors say his body recovered long ago," Henry continued. "But his mind?" He stopped. "That is another matter." Annabel watched the storm outside. "And you believe marriage will fix him?" "No," Henry said honestly. "I believe loneliness is finishing what the storm began." That answer surprised her. Most powerful men lied more beautifully than that. Henry turned toward her again. "My son is not kind anymore, Miss Whitmore. That usually means someone has been hurt too deeply." "You speak as though you know." "I do." For the first time, Henry studied her differently. Not as a candidate. As a person. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Annabel lowered her eyes briefly. "My brother drowned when I was 16. Silence settled heavily between them. "When people survive loss," she said softly, "they either learn to live beside the pain, or they build their entire life around it." Henry looked at her for a very long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "You should meet my son." The lighthouse stood nearly half a mile from the manor. The storm had worsened by evening. Wind tore across the cliffs hard enough to make breathing difficult. A servant carrying a lantern guided her through the darkness until finally the old stone tower appeared through fog and rain. "He's inside," the servant said nervously. "He comes here every night." "Why?" The servant hesitated. "He says someone must keep the light burning." Then the man hurried back toward the manor as though remaining longer might anger the sea itself. Annabel climbed the narrow spiral staircase alone. The higher she climbed, the louder the storm became. By the time she reached the lantern room at the top, the wind sounded almost human. And there he was. Benedict Ashcombe stood beside the great glass windows overlooking the black ocean below. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dark hair slightly too long from neglect. One hand rested against the cold stone wall while the other held a lantern cloth. He didn't turn immediately when she entered, which somehow felt deliberate. "You're either very brave," he said quietly, "or very foolish." His voice surprised her. Oh, controlled. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. People often confuse the two, Annabelle replied. That made him glance back at her. Brown eyes. Sharp and intelligent beneath the exhaustion. And haunted. Not dramatically haunted. Worse. The quiet kind. The kind that lived permanently behind the eyes. You're the new wife candidate, he said flatly. An unpleasant title. It's an unpleasant arrangement. Rain hammered violently against the lighthouse windows. Annabelle walked farther inside. Unlike the dark rooms below, the lantern room glowed gold from the great rotating light above them. Benedict studied her carefully. Most women, she suspected, tried immediately to look delicate around him. She did not. You should leave before this place ruins you too, he said. Annabelle looked directly at him. Places don't ruin people. Pause. Fear does. Something changed in his expression. Briefly. Then vanished. You think you understand me already? No, she said calmly. But I think you understand yourself less than you pretend to. That earned her a cold look. Careful, Miss Whitmore. What? Will honesty offend you? No, Benedict said quietly. Only exhaust me. He turned back toward the sea. The lighthouse beams swept across the black water below in slow circles. Annabelle watched him silently. There was something strange about him. He didn't carry himself like an invalid. He looked strong enough to survive almost anything. But every movement felt restrained. As though some invisible chain held him permanently in place. You come here every night? She asked. Yes. Why? To make sure the light stays on. That sounds lonely. It is. His honesty startled her again. No performance. No dramatic self-pity. Only fact. The storm outside intensified. Lightning flashed over the sea. For 1 second, Benedict's face became fully visible in white light. And Annabelle understood immediately. This was not a man afraid of death. This was a man afraid of living after surviving it. You think those men died because of you? She said quietly. His jaw tightened. I know they did. You were the captain? No, his voice darkened slightly. But I insisted we continue through the storm. Silence. The sailors trusted me. Another lightning flash. They obeyed me. The guilt inside those words felt old enough to have roots. Annabelle stepped closer. And since then? He laughed once without humor. Since then I wake up every morning wondering why I deserved the shore when they didn't. The honesty of it filled the lighthouse. Outside, the sea crashed violently below the cliffs. Annabelle looked at him carefully. You survived, she said. Yes. That isn't the same thing as stealing life from the dead. For the first time since she entered the lighthouse, Benedict truly looked at her. Not politely. Not dismissively. Directly. The silence stretched between them. Heavy. Dangerous somehow. Then Benedict looked away first. You speak like someone familiar with grief. I am. And yet you still believe people recover? Annabelle thought about her brother. About her father afterward. About years spent watching sorrow hollow people from the inside. I believe people learn how to carry it differently. Benedict stared at the sea. The lighthouse beam swept slowly across the waves again. You should go back before the storm worsens, he said finally. It sounded less like dismissal this time. More like concern. Annabelle moved toward the staircase. But before leaving she paused. You know, she said quietly, the sea isn't punishing you. Benedict didn't answer. It's just the sea. For a moment neither moved. Then Annabelle descended the spiral staircase and disappeared into the storm below. Benedict remained standing beside the lighthouse window long after she left, watching the waves, and for the first time in years thinking about something other than guilt. Thinking about her. Over the following weeks, Blackthorn Manor slowly changed. Not dramatically. In small ways. Annabelle noticed Benedict rarely slept. He wandered the cliffs at night during storms. He repaired broken furniture himself rather than calling servants. He secretly left books outside workers' cottages for their children. Once, she caught him carrying an injured seabird inside during heavy rain. You hate people, she told him dryly. I dislike conversation, he corrected. You carried a bird through a storm. It looked stubborn. That explains why you rescued it. You recognize your own kind. To her surprise, Benedict almost smiled. Almost. And slowly, dangerously, something inside the frozen silence of Blackthorn Manor began to thaw. Though neither of them was willing to admit it yet. Winter arrived like a punishment. By December, the sea around Blackthorn Manor had become violent enough to shake the cliffs at night. Wind screamed endlessly against the stone walls, and snow gathered along the narrow roads leading toward the village until eventually the outside world disappeared beneath white storms and darkness. The manor became isolated, cut off. And somehow, inside that isolation, Annabel Whitmore and Benedict Ashcombe began orbiting each other more dangerously than before. Not gently. Never gently. You're staring again. Annabel looked up from her book in the library. Benedict stood near the fireplace with one hand resting against the mantel, dark hair still wet from snow outside. I wasn't staring, she replied. You absolutely were. You looked thoughtful. I looked irritated. There's overlap. That earned her the smallest flicker of amusement. Only a flicker. But she had learned to recognize how rare those moments were. Benedict crossed the room slowly. For weeks now the manor had changed around him. The servants whispered about it constantly. The Duke's son now. Ate dinner downstairs again. Walked through the village occasionally. Spoke more. Slept more. And no longer spent entire days locked inside the lighthouse. Not that Benedict admitted any of this openly. You're smirking, he said suspiciously. I'm observing progress. I'm not a patient. No, Annabel agreed calmly. Patients are usually more cooperative. That made him laugh once under his breath before catching himself immediately afterward. As though joy had escaped accidentally. Annabel noticed. She noticed everything about him. And increasingly that was becoming a problem. The lighthouse became theirs slowly. Not officially. Not intentionally. It simply happened. Some nights Annabel found him there staring at the sea while the giant lantern rotated above them in golden circles. Other nights he found her there first. The storms grew worse after Christmas. One evening, snow struck the lighthouse windows so violently it sounded like thrown gravel. Benedict climbed the final steps carrying oil for the lantern only to stop short when he saw Annabel already inside. Sleeves rolled slightly as she struggled to tighten one of the metal valves. What are you doing? He asked sharply. She glanced over her shoulder. Preventing your precious lighthouse from exploding. It wasn't going to explode. It was leaking oil. That still isn't exploding. You lack imagination. Benedict moved beside her and adjusted the valve with practiced hands. You shouldn't be up here during storms. And yet here I am. He sighed quietly. You're impossible. You dislike that because it means you can't control conversations. I don't want to control conversations. You absolutely do. Benedict looked at her. Snow and wind howled around the lighthouse tower. You notice too much, he said quietly. Annabel looked back at him. And you hide too much. The words settled heavily between them. Benedict turned away first. He always did. Later that night, while the storm battered the cliffs outside, they sat together near the lighthouse lantern wrapped in blankets against the cold. The room glowed gold around them. For a long while neither spoke. Then Benedict finally broke the silence. I used to love storms. Annabel looked toward him carefully. When I was a boy, he continued quietly, I thought storms made the world feel honest. The lantern light moved across his face slowly. My mother hated them. She said the sea takes whatever people love most eventually. Pause. She was right. Annabel watched him carefully. You really believe the sea chose those men? No. Then why do you still act like it did? Benedict stared at the rotating light above them. Because someone should be blamed. And you volunteered. His jaw tightened slightly. You make it sound simple. Maybe it is. That earned her a sharp look. You think guilt disappears because someone tells you to stop feeling it? No, Annabel said softly. I think people grow addicted to punishment when they stop believing they deserve forgiveness. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that changes something permanently. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea. Benedict looked away from her toward the dark windows. You speak like someone who's lost people too. Annabel's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. My younger brother drowned, she said quietly. Benedict turned immediately. The surprise on his face was genuine. He was 14. The lighthouse suddenly felt smaller somehow. My father never recovered from it, she continued. Not truly. Her voice remained calm. Too calm. I spent years watching him survive instead of live. Benedict said nothing. And then, Annabel said quietly, I met you. The wind outside screamed against the glass. Benedict looked at her for a long moment. Is that why you stayed? Yes. Not for the money? No. Not for the title? No. Then why? Annabel held his gaze directly. Because I know what happens when grief becomes someone's entire identity. Something in Benedict's expression shifted painfully, like a door opening somewhere deep inside him. And for one dangerous second, Annabelle realized how close they had become sitting there in the golden lighthouse light. Too close. Close enough to hear each other breathe. Neither moved away. After that night everything changed. Not visibly, but beneath the surface. Benedict began seeking her out unconsciously. He appeared beside her during walks along the cliffs. He lingered after dinner conversations ended. Sometimes she found books left outside her bedroom door without explanation. One afternoon she discovered him repairing fishing nets with villagers near the harbor. "You hate social interaction," she reminded him. "I hate unnecessary social interaction. You repaired nets for 3 hours. They were terrible nets. And this bothered you personally?" "Yes." She laughed softly. Benedict looked at her when she laughed. Not casually. Never casually anymore. And Annabelle felt her heartbeat betray her in deeply inconvenient ways. By February the manor no longer felt haunted. The servants smiled more. Windows stayed open longer. Music occasionally returned to the drawing room because Benedict had begun playing violin again late at night when he thought nobody listened. Annabelle always listened. Always. One evening she found him in the music room staring silently at the violin resting in his hands. "You stopped," she said from the doorway. "I made mistakes. That's usually how music works." Benedict looked up at her. "You make everything sound easier than it is." "No," she said quietly. "I just think fear sounds larger inside your head than it does aloud." For a second neither moved. Then Benedict spoke very softly. "You make me want things again." The honesty of it stole the air from the room. Annabelle's chest tightened painfully. "What kind of things?" she asked before she could stop herself. Benedict looked at her too long. Then quietly. "Dangerous things." The silence afterward felt alive. And Annabelle suddenly understood something terrifying. She was falling in love with him. The storm arrived 3 nights later. A real storm. Not ordinary winter weather. The kind sailors feared. The sea became monstrous beneath black skies while winds shook Blackthorn Manor hard enough to rattle doors from their hinges. Villagers arrived shouting near midnight. A fishing boat was missing. 3 men stranded somewhere beyond the northern rocks. Nobody wanted to sail out. Not in this weather. Not into those waters. Annabelle found Benedict standing frozen near the manor entrance listening to the chaos outside. The color had drained from his face. "It's too dangerous," one villager shouted. "We'll lose more men." Another voice. "The tide's pulling north." Benedict didn't move. Annabelle saw it immediately. The fear. Not of death. Of repeating the past. His hands shook slightly at his sides. The entire manor seemed to hold its breath around him. Then Benedict whispered, "I can't." Annabelle stepped closer. "Yes," she said firmly. "You can. If I make the wrong decision again." "You are not standing on that ship 3 years ago." The storm thundered outside. Benedict's breathing turned uneven. Annabelle grabbed his coat firmly. "You can spend your life fearing the sea," she said, voice cutting through the chaos around them, "or become the man who faces it." Something hit him then. Art. Not anger. Recognition. The villagers waited desperately. Wind screamed through the open doors. And finally Benedict Ashcam moved. Fast. Like someone breaking through invisible chains. "Prepare the rescue boat," he ordered sharply. Everything changed instantly. Men rushed into motion. Lanterns lit. Ropes gathered. Voices shouted through storm winds. And Annabelle watched Benedict transform before her eyes into the man he had once been before grief hollowed him apart. Strong. Certain. Alive. Hours later she stood near the cliffs unable to breathe properly while the storm raged endlessly below. Then finally, lanterns appeared through the darkness. The rescue boat returned. Alive. Villagers ran toward the shore shouting in relief. 3 fishermen survived. Benedict climbed onto the rocks soaked completely through, exhausted and shaking violently from cold. But alive. Annabelle ran toward him before thinking. Before caution. Before pride. And the moment Benedict saw her, something broke open inside both of them at once. He reached for her. She grabbed his coat. And then he kissed her. Not softly. Not carefully. Like a man who had spent years drowning and had finally reached air. Rain poured around them. Wind screamed across the cliffs. But Annabelle only felt his hands against her face and the impossible relief inside the kiss itself. When they finally pulled apart, Benedict rested his forehead briefly against hers, breathing hard. "I thought I'd lose them," he admitted quietly. "But you didn't." His eyes searched hers in the storm. "No," he said softly. "This time I didn't." Spring came slowly to Blackthorn Manor. The snow disappeared first. Then the frozen cliffs softened beneath pale sunlight, and the sea, though still wild, no longer looked angry all the time. Grass returned across the hills in thin green lines, and the villagers began repairing fishing boats along the harbor again. Life moved forward. And for the first time in years, Benedict Ashcombe moved with it. Not perfectly. Not easily. But genuinely. The manor no longer felt silent. Windows stayed open during the afternoons. Fires burned warmer. Servants laughed openly in the hallways without fear of disturbing the house's mood. And Benedict smiled now. Not constantly. But enough for people to notice. Especially Annabel. She noticed everything about him still. The way he slept better when storms were quiet. The way he unconsciously reached for her hand during long carriage rides. The way he stood closer to her now without realizing it. And the way his eyes searched for her first whenever he entered a room. As though somewhere along the way she had become the place his mind rested naturally. That realization terrified her slightly. Because she had stopped pretending this was temporary. She loved him. Completely. One morning in April, Annabel found Benedict near the cliffs repairing an old fishing lantern. "You employ an entire staff," she said, leaning against the doorway. "And yet you insist on fixing everything yourself. It relaxes me. You nearly burned your hand last week. That was one time. You set a towel on fire. It was a small fire." Annabel laughed softly. Benedict looked up immediately at the sound. There it was again. That expression. The one that appeared whenever she laughed. Like he had discovered something rare and still didn't fully trust himself to believe it belonged near him. "You're staring again," she said. "You accuse me of that frequently. Because you do it frequently." He stood slowly and crossed the room toward her. Not rushed. Never rushed anymore. The sunlight from the windows caught the faint scar near his jaw, one left behind by the shipwreck years ago. Annabel had once asked how he got it. He told her. "The sea wanted proof I remembered it." She touched the scar lightly now without thinking. Benedict went still beneath her fingers. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed completely these past months. It no longer felt empty. It felt full of things neither needed words for anymore. Henry Ashcombe began growing weaker in early summer. At first it was small things. Missed meals. Longer silences. Tiredness after short walks. But by June even Benedict could no longer pretend not to see it. One evening Annabel found him alone in the library staring into the fireplace. "He's getting worse," Benedict said quietly before she could speak. Annabel crossed the room slowly. "Yes." The fire crackled softly between them. Benedict rubbed a hand over his face. "I spent years believing he only saw me as a failure." Annabel sat beside him. "And now?" Benedict stared into the flames. "Now I think he was just afraid." The honesty in his voice hurt to hear. Because it was true. Henry Ashcombe had spent years watching his son disappear piece by piece while being powerless to stop it. And powerful men rarely survive helplessness gracefully. A week later Henry asked to speak with Benedict alone. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Annabel waited outside in the garden while sea wind moved softly through the flowers near the cliffs. When Benedict finally emerged from the library, something about him looked different. Not shattered. Worse somehow. Like someone who had just realized his grief had been carrying the wrong face for years. Annabel stood immediately. "What happened?" Benedict looked toward the sea. "My father knew the storm would be dangerous that night." Annabel went still. "He encouraged me to continue the voyage anyway." The garden suddenly felt colder. "He said men follow strength. That hesitation destroys authority." His voice remained calm with visible effort. "And I spent 3 years believing those deaths belonged entirely to me." Annabel stepped closer carefully. "But they didn't." "No," Benedict whispered. Pain moved visibly across his face. "All this time. I carried all of it alone." Annabel touched his hand gently. "You were a son trying to earn his father's approval." Benedict closed his eyes briefly. The weight of that truth nearly broke him. Because deep down, somewhere beneath all the guilt and storms and silence, he had still been that frightened young man wanting his father to look proud of him. Henry died 3 weeks later. Soft rain fell over Blackthorn Manor the entire morning. The sea remained strangely calm. Benedict stayed beside his father until the very end. And when it was over, he stood near the bed silently while the room filled with unbearable stillness. Annabel waited beside the doorway. Not interrupting. not speaking. Just there. Finally Benedict looked toward her with eyes hollowed by fresh grief. I don't know what to do now. The vulnerability in those words nearly shattered her heart. Annabel crossed the room slowly and took his hand. You don't have to know today. For one dangerous second, Benedict looked exactly like the man she met inside the lighthouse months ago. Lost. Exhausted. Standing too close to darkness. Annabel felt fear move sharply through her chest. Not fear of losing him physically. Fear of watching him disappear into silence again. But this time something was different. This time Benedict reached back. His fingers tightened around hers. And Annabel realized healing had changed him more deeply than even he understood. Because months ago he would have suffered alone. Now he let her stay. The weeks after Henry's death were difficult. Some days Benedict barely spoke. Some nights he wandered the cliffs unable to sleep. Once Annabel found him standing outside the lighthouse at nearly midnight staring toward the ocean. You're thinking too loudly again, she said softly as she approached. A faint smile touched his mouth without reaching fully. That's apparently becoming a habit. She moved beside him. The lighthouse lantern turned slowly overhead, sending warm light across the cliffs. I keep expecting grief to feel different, Benedict admitted quietly. How does it feel? Like standing in the same storm twice. Annabel looked toward the sea. My father once told me grief changes shape constantly, she said. That's why people never fully prepare for it. Benedict was quiet for a moment. Then finally, I'm afraid happiness disappears when people notice it too much. Annabel turned toward him immediately. Benedict. I had my mother, he interrupted softly. Then I lost her. I had my father. Then I lost him. Every good thing eventually becomes something I miss. The raw honesty of it hurt. Annabel stepped closer. You are not being punished for loving people. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. And Annabel saw it clearly. The fear underneath everything else. The fear that loving her deeply would eventually destroy him too. She touched his face gently. Healing doesn't mean losing stops hurting, she whispered. It means you stop facing pain alone. The wind moved softly around them. And something inside Benedict finally gave way completely. He pulled her against him tightly, almost desperately, like a man exhausted from carrying himself alone for too many years. Annabel held him just as tightly. And neither let go for a very long time. By late August, the lighthouse had been fully restored. Villagers visited often now. Children ran through the gardens around Blackthorn Manor. Music returned permanently to the manor halls because Benedict had begun teaching violin lessons to local children twice a week. Annabel watched him during one lesson from the doorway unseen. A little girl struggled through a difficult melody before groaning dramatically. I'll never get this part right. Benedict crouched beside her patiently. You know what the sea taught me? He asked. The girl shook her head. That starting over isn't failure. Annabel felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest hearing those words from him. Because months ago Benedict himself could not have believed them. And now he taught them to others naturally. Like healing had become part of his language. One evening near sunset, Benedict took Annabel to the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The same cliffs he once feared approaching. Wind moved through the tall grass softly while golden light spread across the sea below. Benedict stood beside her silently for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. You know what's strange? What? I spent years believing the sea ruined my life. Annabel looked toward him. But it wasn't the sea, he said quietly. Pause. It was the silence afterward. Emotion tightened painfully in her throat. Benedict reached into his coat slowly. Then pulled out a small velvet box. Annabel stared. You already married me once, she managed softly. That wasn't this. His voice shook slightly despite himself. This time I'm asking because I cannot imagine a future that doesn't have you standing inside it somewhere. The sunset burned gold across the water behind him. Benedict looked terrified, which somehow made Annabel love him even more. You carried light into every dark place inside me, he said quietly. Even when I fought you for it. Her eyes filled immediately. Annabel Whitmore. He opened the box. A simple ring. Beautiful without trying too hard. Will you choose me again? Freely this time. Annabel laughed softly through tears. There was never anything forced about loving you. And when she kissed him beneath the lighthouse glow and the endless Scottish sky, Benedict finally understood something the storm years ago had nearly destroyed inside him. Survival was never the end of his story. It was only the beginning. 2 years later, Blackthorn Manor no longer looked haunted. The cliffs still held storms. The sea still roared violently some nights. But the house itself had changed. It breathed now, laughed now, lived. The lighthouse lantern never went dark anymore. One evening, their young daughter stood beside Benedict watching fog roll across the sea below. "Papa?" "Yes." "Why do we keep the light on every night?" Benedict looked toward the lighthouse. Then toward Annabel standing nearby wrapped in a coat against the wind. A soft smile touched his face. "Because," he said quietly, "someone once carried a light for me when I couldn't carry it myself." Annabel's eyes met his. And far below the cliffs, waves crashed endlessly against the shore while the lighthouse beam turned through the darkness. Steady, warm, and impossible to lose.